Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Innovation Showcase. The main purpose of this ongoing series is to inform viewers about exciting innovations and creative individuals across the fields of business, science, technology, education, and the arts. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Dr. Mike Coogan. Mike is a research assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire's Center for Sustainable Seafood Systems. He's here today to share with us his groundbreaking work that explores a new, environmentally friendly approach to scallop farming. Instead of suspending scallops in vertical nets, Mike and his team have pioneered a low impact method of raising them in deep water on the ocean floor, where scallops naturally thrive. During the program, we'll hear how this innovative method came about, how it's grown and developed, and how it's opening the door to a more sustainable, more resilient, and more economically viable future for regional seafood. Let's start by meeting Mike. Welcome. So delighted to be able to be here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and love your show. So very psyched.
It's been fascinating reading about your groundbreaking efforts. Eager to hear more and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, Mike, would you please just spend a few minutes or so sharing a little bit about your background, research interest, academics, professional, please?
Sure. So yeah, like you said, I'm a research assistant professor at University of New Hampshire. I've been here for about 3 years, and I've been doing aquaculture sort of informally my whole life, but more formally for the past decade or so. And started off in Miami working on tropical species, mostly finfish species. I still do a lot of work with fish, but more in the last few years, especially since moving back up to New England, I've been really passionate about the sort of lower trophic level species, the ones that you don't have to feed, whether it be, the
Mhm.
seaweeds, kelp and seaweeds and macroalgae and things like that, but more specifically, and more focused on the shellfish, the bivalves, so oysters, mussels, clams, and of course scallops. And here in New England, we have beautiful coastline, sort of endless water when you look out onto the seas, and a lot of my work has been in the more offshore space. So most of the aquaculture,
Mhm.
at least in the United States, is very near coastal or within these estuaries, but there's a whole lot more water out there, and so that's what I have a strong passion for and a really strong draw towards kind of going as far offshore as I can. I'm in my happy place, far away
Nice.
when I can't see land, and there's tons and tons and tons of potential there, and a lot less people to worry about when you're out there. It's still like the high seas, the last frontier, if you will.
Yes, nice, nice. Well, before we hear much more about that, just a quick word because I find it fascinating too, all the efforts at UNH's Center for Sustainable Seafood Systems.
Yeah, so that center started pretty much right when I got there. That's kind
Mm.
of why I was hired on, was to start off and help build this program. Our director, Dave Fredrickson, was brought in from the Naval Academy, and he's got many years. He's an engineer actually, so half my team are engineers and the other half are biologists,
Oh.
and so we're able to solve a lot of the complex problems together with this sort of multidisciplinary approach. That's kind of the most unique part about the work and the team that we have. Every project we think very differently, but every project requires both types of those different mindsets and all of the different tools and skills that we all have. And so our main goal, we do a lot of aquaculture, but it's really based on producing seafood and producing seafood locally. We are sort of flagship project is the Aquafort, and it's what's called a integrated multi-trophic aquaculture system. And what that means, if you ever think of a food chain, you have maybe sharks up on top and plankton all the way on the bottom. And every one of those different levels is a different trophic level depending on what
Mm.
they eat. And so the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture has animals or organisms from these different levels, and it makes it a much more sort of ecosystem-based approach.
Mhm,
So
mm.
we at the Aquafort, it's just a big a pretty small platform, actually. It's two 20 by 20-foot bays where we grow steelhead trout. And on the outside, we grow sugar kelp and blue mussels that act as a sort of biological curtain. And so they're absorbing a lot of the nutrients that the fish might be emitting and attracting a lot of other fish and other creatures around that area as well. And so,
Wow, you'll have to come back and share more about this
yeah.
overall approach. But let's move on. And interested to hear what first inspired you to explore alternatives to the traditional scallop farming methods.
Yeah. So, I mean, we don't have a lot of scallop farming in the United States. We have the largest wild scallop fishery in the world by quite a large margin. But we still have to import about half of our scallops to
Mm,
meet demand, whereas all of the scallops we're importing are farmed. So a lot of it's from China, a lot of it's from Japan. They were sort of the pioneers of this. And they typically use what's called suspended methods, suspended gear. So you can either have them in these sort of tiered nets and grow them out, a few to maybe 50 individuals per these different tiers. And it works really well over there where they have a ton of these protected bays with deep water and, you know, uh, a lot fast flowing currents, not a lot of predators, and not a lot of potentially, species that can entangle in them. That's sort of the main thing I'm getting at
mhm,
here. I was mentioning going offshore, and most of our waters, we don't have all these little bays. And the bays that we do have, you think of like the Chesapeake and things like that, they're typically pretty shallow and too warm
mm,
to grow scallops. And so in the Gulf of Maine, you have all of these protected bays, but again, often not with these deep waters. And the other thing that we have to deal with in New England is we have the North Atlantic right whale, which is critically endangered. There's only about 350 individuals left. And with any of these suspended gear methods, what you typically have is you'll have, buoys on two ends, anchors, and then a headline, and then a bunch of these, I call them lantern nets, but a bunch of
mhm,
suspended lantern nets along that. So that can create a potential hazard for some of these species, whales, turtles, and other things that pass by and are feeding in that zone.
mm,
And if they get caught up in that, it could be catastrophic for them. And when we have so few individuals left, you really want to take care that you're not creating any hazards for them. And so we didn't really invent anything. Some people have been doing this method before, but really the scallops are what who've been doing this for much, much longer. They're not naturally found floating around in the water column in gears. They're naturally found along the seabed. And so we thought that that made the most sense to put them where they're supposed to be,
mhm,
and away from potential, whales and other important organisms. And so we got a grant from Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to look at culturing scallops, oysters, and mussels in this bottom gear. And so we did a 2-year trial, and we found that they all grow okay. None of them were really dying as long as you got them in nice deep water where they're safe from storms and waves and all of that. But the mussels and the oysters didn't grow very fast. Certainly nowhere near as fast as what would become economically viable and what's currently used in the industry. And if it's
mhm,
not economically viable, then it's not sustainable. You can't really use it. But the scallops, on the other end, they grew like crazy. They loved being down there. They had really high survival, growth rates as high as any other methods that we've seen. And the big thing was they had no what's called biofouling. So other organisms, whether they be, algae or barnacles or anything else, everything wants to grow on everything in the ocean, especially in that upper water
mm,
column where
mhm,
there's a lot of light, a lot of food. Things just attached to everything. If you go to a marina, you find everything's covered in barnacles, everything's covered in mussels. But once you get them below sort of that photic light zone and down to cool, deeper waters, a lot fewer things grow there. So we were pulling up these cages and they were spotless. We would leave them out there for
mm.
6 months at a time and pull
Wow.
them up. And, you would put in these 1-inch scallops, and the next time you checked on them, they were an inch and a half. And the only thing that was growing was them. Nothing was growing on them. And that's huge for an aquaculturist, for a farmer, because we have, it's a hard job. There's a lot of labor that goes involved in it, and there's a lot of cleaning. It's amazing how much cleaning I do as part of my job. But yeah, it was sort of, it worked out really well. And so we chased some more funding through NOAA, and we were really fortunate. We got an SK grant, and that has continued this project and allowed us to dive a lot deeper into the nitty-gritty and trying to turn it from an idea into a potentially profitable industry.
Well, you're definitely well on your way. To that extent, we're fortunate that you have a selection of images that'll help us better appreciate and understand what your work has involved. If we could segue to that, and then we'll continue our conversation, Mike.
So yeah, this is just pulling a little presentation that I had based on this project, and it's a 2-year project that we're working on. And if you look at that photo there, that's off of Newcastle, New Hampshire, and that's where a lot of our aquaculture takes place.
Mm,
And we're standing on a beach right now in New Hampshire, looking across the bay is Maine. And so we do a lot of work sort of in both with New Hampshire farmers and Maine farmers as well.
nice.
And here's just the team from the Center of Sustainable Seafood System. So I'm not going to go through all of them individually, but you can
Sure,
see
sure.
we've got a big team, and everyone is necessary in these efforts, from commercial fishermen to divers to engineers and biologists.
Yeah, it's fascinating, as you explained earlier, to hear the multidisciplinary, multi-job approach, which I think is the nature of just research in so many fields these days. But let's move on. Pleased to hear about your work.
Cool. So yeah, so we really have the main goal is not to just do research for this project, but it's to help develop an industry and help, the main mission for our center is really to produce sustainable seafood, and that means, empowering fishermen, farmers, and the people that eat seafood. It's a whole community-based approach. And so we're thinking about that with all our different objectives. So, but biology is obviously critical. If you can't grow them, you can't sell them. And so we're really starting from the ground up. So we know that they do grow, but we want to figure out the best ways to do all of this, create sort of an SOP, a best management practices. And so first is determining the locations, the densities to grow them at, and the gear types to grow them along the bottom. There's a few different options, and unlimited options of densities. And the more you can grow in an area, the more profitable you can be. But often that there's a sacrifice with mortality and how fast they grow. So important things to figure out. And then beyond that, figuring out the economics. And then obviously everyone loves scallops. They're delicious, but no sense in creating in growing a fast growing scallop if it doesn't taste good. So we want to see, do they taste as
Mm.
good? Do they have the right texture and all of that? So, even meat quality is a huge part of this. And that includes, buying fancy instruments to see the different textures. There's obviously going to be a taste component because we gotta eat what we grow. And that'll be a fun part that I'm looking forward to. So looking at how they taste and compared to our wild caught scallops, as well as the different methods of culturing them from the suspended gear to the bottom gear. Um, and then we are very fortunate that there is a healthy scallop population out there, and there's a lot of what we call spat, the babies. So these free floating larvae that the scallops will typically spawn during the summer, and they've got roughly a 40-day larval period where they're floating around before it's time for them to settle. And they like to settle on hard substrates. So I'll show you some pictures in a minute of what the collectors look like. But all our babies that we're collecting are collected from the wild, and there's very few hatcheries that are raising them from the larval
Mm.
stages. So we're trying to figure out when to set out the collectors, where to set out the collectors, where in the water column it is, because we're dealing with 3D space
Mm.
along currents and all of that, and what materials work best. And some of that's already been figured out, but we're trying to really lock it down and tie it not just to like a specific date, but to, certain temperatures, because with climate change and with, the ridiculous weather that we're experiencing all the time, we want to know when to set this gear out and to get the best results. And then disease can be a problem as well, and we want to make sure that we don't have any diseases, or if there are any diseases, that we can mitigate them and isolate them. So that's part of it as well. And then, of course, working with farmers and fishermen and trying to get them involved and pass all this information on to develop an industry. And so I mentioned the North Atlantic right whale, and so This is showing sort of like your traditional uh, lobster fishing gear, which right whales can get entangled in.
Hmm.
Entanglement and vessel strikes are the main causes of mortality with these North Atlantic right whales, and there's so few left. So we want to make sure that anything we're putting out in the water column is not going to be a further hazard for these whales. And so here is our site. We're in New Hampshire waters, still in state waters, and we've got a 130-acre site in waters ranging from about 23 meters to 40 meters, so 65 to 140 or so feet. And it's pretty flat bottom. And so we've mapped out that bottom. We know where we want to set our gear. We also this spot was purchased from some previous lobster fishermen, and it's located on all the charts, so other fishermen know
Mm.
not to set gear there, and that's going to be really important because we don't want to interfere with other fishermen. If we're trying to create an industry, don't want to hurt another industry at the same time. And yeah, this is sort of what it looks like. So between August and October, and we're still trying to lock down specific dates and times, but you want to set out this gear. Can you see my mouse on there?
Yes. Yeah. Can.
Perfect. So this would be a spat collector. And one of the main reasons is, you have to have a vertical line during this spat collection stage. And so that's why we want to really hone down on the time period is because you want these lines out as short as possible. And so you have an anchor. You have a vertical line with a toggle buoy so that even as the tides change, we have really big tides in Maine, this will always stay taut. And then you have a surface buoy. And on all of these are all spat collecting bags. They're basically just plastic mesh bags.
Hmm.
You can see over here filled with some more plastic mesh. And I mentioned that the spat, the babies, they want to settle on hard substrate. Typically that's the bottom, but they're floating around for, weeks and weeks and weeks looking for this hard
Mm.
substrate.
Mm.
And they want it to be nice and clean. They don't want to settle on something that's already has a bunch of growth on it. So they'll settle on here after about 40 days and, between August and October, and they'll grow out through the winter. And then we come out in the spring and they look like this. They're jam-packed full, and you have to go in one by one, pull the material out and sort them. And there might be barnacles and mussels and all sorts of, tunicates and sea squirts and things like that that like to grow on them. And you want to remove all of that as quickly as possible because that's going to interfere with growth. It's going to help make them scallop babies stick together, and it's no good. But on this first on this first deployment, we set out in 2024, 4 lines at 3 different periods. And so we had about 12 lines going out with 4 bags apiece, and we were able to collect about 10,000 scallops in there. So we got
Wow.
a little video.
Mm.
And so we're trying to go to 100,000 this year, and then hopefully eventually to 1 million scallops.
Mm.
That's the first stage. Then there's the grow out stage, but you need the seed to start, and you can see them swimming around. So unlike
Yeah.
other shellfish, they don't stay in one place for the rest of their lives. That beautiful scallop meat is what's known as the adductor muscle, and that's what allows them to open and close and to swim away. And because they're able to swim, they're constantly exercising that muscle, and that's what makes it so
Mm.
big, strong, and delicious. But they're so fun to watch when they're this age. And they're beautiful when they're this age. So you don't see this with the adults, but
Mm.
when they're young, they have these incredible, incredible patterns. Um, and unfortunately, slowly lose them throughout time, but really cool to work with.
No,
And
this was new to me when, yeah, you shared some earlier images. Fascinating to see.
yeah, well, it was new to me too, so I'm glad you found it exciting. But they are gorgeous. And here's just pulling some of this gear out, and you can see they're totally loaded, but there's also a lot of this fouling along the side, which can really choke them out if you leave them out too long. And then basically beyond that, you're growing them out. You're setting these trawls out the same way you would set out a lobster trawl.
Mm.
But instead of having a lobster pot, you have these sort of scallop pots. And so this was first these 6 bag condos, and in each bag you can load it up with potentially hundreds of baby scallops. And because we want to be really cognizant of the right whale issue, we have this acoustic release mechanism here. So we would normally have a vertical line here, or you would in a scallop trawl. connected to a buoy, and you just go
Mm.
and grab that buoy. But in this case, you can basically ping down an acoustic signal, and it'll release the rope with the buoy only
Oh,
when you
wow.
need it. Yeah.
Wow. Fabulous.
It is. And that's why we need people like engineers, because I have no idea how to, I know how it works now, but I don't have no idea how to design this stuff.
Yeah.
And the really cool thing about this kind of work is you can, again, we're trying to create an industry, but we're also trying to help what already exists. And the lobster industry is by far the biggest industry, fishing industry in the Gulf of Maine and in New England in general. Scallops are number two, actually. But we want to make sure that, they that the fishermen have jobs for a long, long time to come, and they're facing a lot of challenges right now. And so we want to provide alternative means of income for when times get tough. And with regulation and climate change and all these other issues, times are more and more frequently becoming tough. And so we want to provide them with gear that looks a lot like the gear that they're already using. They don't have to buy all sorts of fancy new equipment or anything like that.
Hmm.
A lobster fisherman could go out and fish and grow scallops exactly like this tomorrow if they wanted to, which is pretty cool.
Fabulous. Fabulous.
And then this is sort of what this gear looks like. Before we had these big six bag condos, which are heavy, they're difficult to deal with. We started working with this company, Seascale, up in Maine, and they just happened to kind of have the exact same idea that we have pretty much around the same time that we have. And they
Hmm.
developed these scallop pots that are the same exact size as a 3-foot lobster trap, and they work fairly similarly, but instead of catching lobsters, you're growing scallops. And this was after a 6-month deployment, and you can see the gear is not sparkling, but it's pretty clean. There's not
Yeah.
all sorts of things growing. And these were grown at about 110 feet. So once you get down there, they're safe and sound and growing like crazy. And then here's some growth data. We don't need to dive into this too much, but you can, basically just follow them over a year, and you can see they're growing fairly well, and they are growing at pretty similar rates to what you'd find in other gear. And so over on the top right, this is these lantern nets that I mentioned earlier. So you can
Yeah.
see they're really beautiful, and they do a good job of growing scallops. But this was, I assume, taken in Japan in one of these protected bays. If you were to put something like this out in the Gulf of Maine over a winter, it would get absolutely destroyed, no question.
Hmm.
Um, uh, but here's some of the other types of gear that we have. So here's the C-scale triple pots. Here are the condos that have 6 bags. And then here's a 30 bag condo, I guess, if you will, that can obviously grow a whole lot of scallops, but different type of growing method. A lobster fisherman would probably be less used to using this type of gear, but you can grow them out in all sorts of ways. So, some more beautiful pictures of scallops, but
Yeah.
this is I'm not going to dive into this too much. This is just sort of some short-term and long-term impacts that we're trying to have. But I'm happy to continue talking about this project if you have any questions.
Yeah. What major scientific unknowns remain?
Quite a few. So we know what temperatures they like to grow out. We know naturally what depths they're found at. They can be found as typically found within 100 meters, but they can be found up to 300, 400 meters deep. But they really
Hmm.
like that sort of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius range. And if you go sort of too high above that, they get stressed out. If you go too far below that, they don't really grow very quickly. So we know that biology, but we don't necessarily know what densities they like to be housed at. We don't know the best areas to catch the baby spat to collect them. Um, we also want to do some restocking for them as well and help support the wild population. And that has a whole host of other challenges, whether there are predators, where to stock them out, again, what sort of densities to leave them out, and what environments to set them out at. Um, we, don't know what they're going to look like after 3 years, what their
Hmm.
texture or taste is going to look like. Um, we Yeah, I mean the density is going to be a big one for us. What density they form these huge aggregations in the wild sometimes that can last a season or can last a long time. You go to George's Bank and you have pretty consistent huge aggregations of millions and millions and millions of tons of scallops. Uh, but there's a lot of reasons why they like that area, and we're still trying to figure that out. And then, with ocean currents, trying to figure out where their larvae are uh, settling after that can be difficult. So, I mean, there's a ton to learn still.
In closing, what does truly sustainable aquaculture look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Um, Basically, to me, it means having, in an ideal world, I'd like to say, having no impact on the in the natural environment, on the surrounding environment. But no matter what you do, you're always going to have an impact, butterfly effect, if you will. But I
Mm.
think that you can have a positive impact. And I think with shellfish aquaculture, it's pretty easy to have a positive impact. With oysters, we've seen a lot of that work. They create habitat, they sequester nitrogen and carbon, and they are, very clearly a net positive for the environment that they're put in. The scallops, while they don't create habitat the same way, some of this gear will, and they also are, filter feeders. They're cleaning the water. They're sinks for carbon, and so they're helping with climate change mitigation. Um, but I think also more importantly is looking at the alternatives and looking at the best, most efficient way to basically produce food for people. And that's not just in the biology, but it's also in, how you get food to somebody's plate at home. And the way that
Mm.
we're doing it right now, is and nothing against certain practices, but the wild fishery has a lot of issues. They're going out to deep water and they're basically dragging along the bottom and pulling up whatever they catch. And it's, they're doing great work. And the fact that they're feeding a lot of
Mm.
families out there, but there is a lot of bycatch and they're destroying a lot of the bottom habitat, and who knows how long that'll last. Or whereas we still have to import half of our scallops. And like I said, those are coming from Japan, they're coming from China. And so it's not just about how they grow them over there. That means now that first off, we have no idea about their practices over there, whether they're what we
Mm.
consider, humane to their workers, and also whether they're sustainable for the environment there. But then again, you have to ship them thousands and thousands of miles, and the carbon footprint of that is enormous. And so, I think looking at the carbon footprint of all different ways to grow food and to get calories in and hopefully healthy, tasty calories, aquaculture and especially shellfish aquaculture is by far one of the more sustainable ways in the world. Um, Certainly way better than anything you're going to grow on land and much better than most fishing practices.
Oh, very promising indeed. Mike, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the program. How can viewers and others continue to follow the work of you and your rest of your colleagues?
Well, you can check out our website, the Center for Sustainable Seafood System at University of New Hampshire. We try and stay pretty active. We don't have social media, but you can at least look at our site, and we're regularly posting things on there. Um, you can We actually started a podcast recently.
Ah,
So
nice.
that's on our work, but also on other aquaculture work in general. It's called Get Aquaculture. So check us out on there. Um,
Terrific, terrific. We'll have those resources in the closing credits. But for now, just want to thank you again for taking the time to be here to explain, outline fascinating work you and your colleagues are doing, and just want to wish you continued success with future endeavors.
I appreciate it very much. Thanks for having me. It was really nice to talk to you, Jay.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.